Hello and welcome to the Our Race Test Taster, flipping the power of storytelling together. I'd like to start by acknowledging the lands we're recording on today. Pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that to paying respects for all the various lands that people might be listening to this recording on. Sovereignty was never ceded. We're going to start off by asking you to think about how you might navigate answering this consent request.
Aquí tenemos un formulario de consentimiento que queremos que ustedes leen y eligen una de las dos opciones, opción A o opción B. Si ustedes responden A, no me pongo que mis imágenes se utilicen con fines antes mencionados. O B, me gustaría que mis imágenes no se utilicen con fines antes mencionados. Y ya está. Okay, so with that responses to that consent form, which you could tell was, well, you might have been able to tell that was in Spanish. And what we've got here is two options that you might have responded to. The first one, where it starts with no, is actually yes. You're saying you will give consent that we can use your image in any way that we choose, including our affiliates. If you answered B, you are not giving us that consent, but it is quite confusing. Additionally, in the brackets there, we've also included a default option. So if you hadn't responded to it, you would automatically give us the consent for us to use your images in any way that we choose.
And so how would you navigate that? Maybe if you speak Spanish, you probably had the answers. But if not, you can see how it can be. That experience is basically completely disorientating. And also not really knowing exactly what you're signing up for, exactly what you're doing, is a really unfair pressure to put on anyone. And this is often what happens, and the sort of pressures that we put on story holders and what that consent process can feel like for them. And that is why free, prior, and ongoing informed consent is essential for story partners when working with story holders. And this is the first principle.
And so, yes, language is so important. And whether it be the first language or even your second language. And this free, prior, and ongoing informed consent is essential when we start looking at safe, ethical storytelling. And this is the first principle of the 5 principles that we'll go through today, which are the 5 principles part of our test framework.
So we'll start by looking at what does a typical standard consent clause look like. So within the consent forms, they have many clauses, and this is an example of a typical clause in there. These are the sort of clauses that you might find in pretty much most standard contracts across all different professions, whether it be marketing and communications, research, film and television, public speaking, events and conferences, and more. And what we can see with some of the language used here is this extremely extractive. The company is effectively taking total control of this person's story, well, irrevocably, exclusively, royalty-free and unconditionally for any purpose, etc., worldwide and in perpetuity without remuneration. While reading this and looking at this in a little bit of detail might seem like it's quite extreme, this is actually very much a standard process when it comes to consent and contracts. They're often written by lawyers to protect the organization and are not written in the interest of the story holders whatsoever.
And this is something that needs to be leveled out, because if we don't have that and it's only written in the benefit of the organization, the potential impact on story holders can be massive.
And often the person requesting the consent form doesn't realize this. So to look at some of the potential impacts, here's an example. So this is a young girl and had this photo taken. Her mother gave consent at the time, and they weren't really aware of what the photos would be used for. And then years and years later, the photo appeared on the side of a building in this context. The mother was aware of this and was not under the understanding that that's what it would be used for. So without that sort of respectful and informed ongoing consent. This is an example of the sort of thing that can happen. You can have these people who go in willingly and they assume they're good intentions, and next thing, it can be used in a way that is potentially very harmful to the story holders. So despite the intention of the original request, there's still a potential for the story holder's agency to be completely removed without that consent process. And that brings us to the first question to consider.
Yeah, and so considering this question, how do you ensure that story holders are central to your consent process, rather than what often occurs, which we just mentioned before? So what we do is we'll work with the organizations, and as we'll call them, story partners, when they're working side by side with the story holders. And we also work with story holders using this test framework to address this common issue. So these tailored workshops and also collaborative consulting are designed to ensure story holders are always centered throughout the consent process. And a key component to ensuring that story holders are centered is respecting lived experience as expertise. But we can't do that without also considering the second principle, which is around resourcing and sensitivity.
Now, a lot of these principles and the test principles are interlinked, and you can't genuinely implement one without the other. You can't have free, prior, and ongoing informed consent without providing appropriate resourcing and sensitivity of the story holders. In fact, frequently, resourcing and sensitivity are not even considered. Here's an example of what a storytelling request can feel like or look like.
Yes, how you going, Miss can I just call you Miss J? Yes, Miss J. I don't know who spoke to you last year, but my name is John Smith from Refugees in Need. How you going today? Great. Look, now I wanted to call you because we have our annual Refugee Community Day. And as usual, we want to hear from the community and get some authentic community stories. And someone said that you'd be perfect. Tammy told me that every time you speak, there's not a dry eye left in the room. Your story is just so inspirational. Especially those with kids. It's just so heartbreaking but relatable and really helps people to get a better picture of the sorts of journeys that people go through before coming to us. Yeah. So look, it's the same format as usual. You're used to it. Basically, roughly a 10-minute story from you. It's not super strict, but somewhere around there. There'll be a 10-minute question time as well at the end. And then we usually encourage you to stay around and eat some food if you're able to. That'd be fantastic. As always, we don't have much of a budget, but I'm not supposed to say this, but this year we've got book vouchers for the speakers and special guests, so that's pretty cool. Better than the usual Coles voucher, hey? If that's cool, I'll text you the details after this. Look, you were the first recommendation, and you're the first person I called because you're basically a mini celebrity around here, and we'd love to continue working with you next year. I've got your email and your number, obviously, so I'll text you information soon, okay? Okay, great, yep, you have a great day, yep, I'll see you soon, okay, bye.
So just like the consent form we showed you earlier, this is a mock recording, and it's intended to highlight some of the common practices that we hear storytellers telling us about, and the story holders ourselves that we hear often occurs. It's standard practice in many ways, and a lot of the different elements that were within that recording. And listening to that, you may ask, what are the parts of the request that could have been done better?
Yeah, and you might even want to just pause the video at this stage and start thinking about that, and thinking about the events, all the times you've invited story holders to share their stories. Because in the end, when we're talking about storytelling, in this context, in the context when we talk about test, we're talking about what happens at different stages. So the beginning of the story is when the inception of the idea occurs. So it's the idea of that project beginning. And then there's another part which goes through to the during the event, where the story is being shared, recorded, and then what happens post-event, including the recording of it, how that recording will be used, and then afterwards, what is the relationship like? Is it an ongoing relationship, or is it transactional like you see in business? Unfortunately, we see too regularly, and we hear from story holders that it becomes very transactional, and it becomes this cycle where the time they're next engaged is for the next event, which is already been formed without respecting the sensitivity or resourcing them appropriately for that time.
And the common practice occurs in a way that storyholders are not paid as experts and have strict conditions placed on their timing, delivery, content, and overall narrative as dictated by the story extractor or interpreter. Story extractors that do this can often be rightfully called out for this type of extractive storytelling, as we see in these examples.
And here we have the first one, and what we can see here is it's a real issue around the sensitivity not being respected and this idea of extraction, the mining of someone's story. So you can read that yourself and sort of see how that stories can be taken from someone to be used for someone's own benefit, profit, purpose, reputation. And this is really problematic and too common to see. And another one here, we've got to show around collaboration, but not real collaboration.
So this is Maxine Benjamin-Clark. And yeah, she's given an example of this idea of people asking for collaborations. And what they're really doing is, meaning they'll do some Instagram posts. And this sort of request often comes with an assumption that exposure is a fair exchange for a storyholder's story. And it also comes with an assumption that the value of the storyholder is the telling of it to an audience, not centering the storyholder's day-to-day life and experience before and after the request, and not respecting the storyholder's lived expertise and their just professional expertise. So for those that are telling other people's stories, the first question that you need to ask before undergoing any of this work is, are you the right person to be telling this story? For this, you need to sit in this space of cultural humility to see if by telling this story, it may actually disempower the storyholders. To embed test, storyholder empowerment is essential and the third principle of the framework.
So you might be asking that question a few times and might be revisiting it several times because you might be challenged by the idea that you aren't the right person. And that's a good place to be, because that's then moving away from that place of being the expert and letting the person lived experience be the expert. And that's when we talk about empowerment. So the empowerment of storyholders, it means people actually, or story partners, creating spaces and opportunities for storyholders to have the power to tell their stories on their terms without the traditional gatekeeping. This means valuing the local lived experience as the authority to narrate the story, just as we'll see in this short excerpt from Muhammad al-Kurd right here.
You know, people, for example, people in Gaza are often mad at me because they don't speak as much about Gaza, which is so true. Like, we only tend to mention Gaza, as you guys say it. We only tend to mention it when it's getting bombarded. But as much as I want to talk about it, I don't have the authority to narrate Gaza. I don't have the arrogance of an American journalist who thinks they can go to Gaza, you know, and be like, here with you live, Chad from the Gaza Strip. I don't have that. And I wish, we have... And, you know, I wish, as much as I learn and I write about it, but I think the next phase in this is to empower other Palestinians, because we exist across the stretches of desperate geographies, of desperate legal statuses. We are facing this dispossession differently. If you're not getting demolished, you're getting bombed. If you're not getting bombed, you're getting evicted. If you're not getting evicted, your residency is getting revoked. And you need people who are able to narrate that with authority. And yes, it's wonderful that I'm in the public eye, I'm in the spotlight, but it would be even more powerful if media organizations were able to make structural changes to implement Palestinians who have the authority to speak about certain things. And when I mean like implement Palestinians, I don't mean hiring an intern to grab you coffee, but correspondence.
So many important points there. As he says, structural changes are necessary for empowerment to occur. Rather than, as we see here on this board where it's the post-it stickers, this is what we commonly see within the way that stories are presented, and they are disempowering rather than empowering.
There's often an assumption that awareness of a story is the most important thing, or that's kind of the focus. And and that therefore equals empowerment. But without having storyholder agency across the telling of that story, even though many people may hear the story, it doesn't automatically mean that storyholders are empowered at all. It's standard practice that story instructors consider and measure the success of their stories by the impact on the audience, such as how many views, audience attendance, the size, and the spend of campaign. But what isn't considered is the impact on the storyholders and their communities before, during, and after the story. Is the telling of the story in fact positively impacting the storyholder and their communities at all?
So yeah, without having storyholders in these positions of influence, we see many of these practices perpetuated, with storyholders being decentered in the telling of their own stories, and stories being used to serve other agendas instead. And this is something we've seen quite commonly in the area around the LGBTI movement.
Yeah, so this is an example of what's known as rainbow washing. And so here you can see that there's a movement. Obviously, it's a big thing that a lot of people are talking about. And so companies realize that it's in their interest to publicly support these movements. And so they put their logo out and they start supporting these movements. One of the questions, though, you have to ask, though, is that genuine storyholder empowerment and engagement, or is it rainbow washing? So here's an example. If we look at this Walmart tweet, we can see below this very cute little dog being used to represent Pride Month, the Walmart support. But just above that is a donation, as an example of the donations that Walmart was making directly to political parties that are actively and publicly anti-LGBTIQ+. And on the right is another example. So all those companies were publicly supporting marriage equality while at the same time, publicly donating a lot of money that working directly against the communities that they were claiming to support. So when companies use a movement for their own benefit because it's so popular that it becomes in their interest to show public support, is that true empowerment? And how do the storyholders tangibly benefit from those campaigns?
So that question really makes us consider this of like, how do you ensure that storyholders have genuine decision-making power? Not this idea of they're just being included but on the side, but actually central to that decision-making. It's not just about representation. It's about having full decision-making power. And the most direct way for us to do that is to ensure storyholders hold that decision-making power through genuine co-design and collaboration, which is the fourth principle that we talk about. And this co-design collaboration, it challenges the ways that we traditionally look at consulting. Like consultation maintains or even exacerbates that power differential between an organization and the storyholders and communities, where the persons of that organization are viewed as often the experts, while the storyholders are perfectly positioned to be commodified, as we can see in this next example.
Now, before we get started today, I would like to introduce everybody to Ron Carter. And don't be scared because he's a white fella. Kevin. He works in the city as part of the cultural development team. Oh. So let's say a good welcome to Ron.
Hey. Thanks, Katie. I look forward to working with everyone.
Great. Well, Arnie Pam has had so many great ideas, like market stores and a jazz concert featuring Ursula Jovovich. Oh! Yes! She got a lovely voice, that one.
Yeah, I don't know. Just feels a bit gammon, don't you think? Traditional food and music is much better than bongos and churro sticks.
Yeah, well, it'll be a mixture of local and international acts, yeah.
I hear what you're saying, but our advantage here is I'm the Migaloo Mulliga.
Oh, God.
I can see what non-Indigenous people are expecting. And believe me, it's not a jazz band. People want to see Gurrumal. Why can't we get Gurrumal?
Well,
I get it. We're trying to break stereotypes. But let me break it down from the Gubba perspective.
Is this motherfucker mansplaining?
If you're offering up jazz and tapas, people may as well come to some Wodjila market. Trust me, people want the blackfella experience. So embrace it.
Hold up. This isn't for white mob. This is for our mob. Just because you get us, don't mean you can talk to us like shit.
No, I don't mean it like that at all. I just think we can do so much better. Look, I voted Greens. I don't celebrate Australia Day. I mean, I listen to the Hot 100, but I'm coming at this from a place of best intentions.
Yeah, well, the stolen generation was done in best intentions, and look where that got us, you big mission manager.
You should be grateful for this opportunity. Namaste.
So that example, it's obviously a comedy sketch, but it actually did a really fantastic job at highlighting many of the problems that often occur in this sort of consulting process. As you can see in that video, the person who came in assumed that they were the expert. They came in assuming that they had all the answers, and that the people that were involved in the so-called consultation really had no idea what they were talking about, despite being the story holders themselves.
And here we had those different sort of examples that we'd see in typical consultation where collaboration and the expertise of lived experience is not prioritized. And so it leads us to question, what does genuine co-design and collaboration look like?
And this is something that we work with story partners to explore in our work, and it's fundamental to all the work we do. We always ensure that story holders are centered throughout the process and that their lived experience and expertise is recognized, valued, and respected. See, without this approach, it's impossible for genuine co-design and collaboration to occur, and story holders are at risk of being used rather than respected. And we're not the only ones to be calling out traditional consulting practices. Here are some strong First Nations women who are calling out consulting processes they've been involved in or left out of, and where they are the experts and they're not seen or valued like that in any way. And the question, I guess, worth asking, is this something that you might do even inadvertently?
And that leads us to the next question we want you to think about is, how do you move from that consultative model that we've become so accustomed to and become so normalized to one where it's collaborative, where it's listening to the community first, putting the story holders at the center and the experts of their lived experience and knowing what the solutions might be or could be. And with this, it's really going to that point of what does genuine co-design and collaboration look like to maintain that integrity of any story. And so that takes us on to that next principle.
So to maintain the integrity of any story, it's the story holders who need to be determining that. If it's left for those without the lived experience, story holders can be undermined, commodified, and erased. So in this example, at the Youth International Climate Conference, we can see on the left the photo that was sort of published and sort of sent around the world in the papers, and on the right was the original photo. And for the story holder involved in this, who was just as involved as anyone else, she felt absolutely undermined and excluded. And not only that, but you can see in that quote below that the impact on her, and not just on her own self and perception of self, but even on who she was representing in that particular context at an international conference, was absolutely devastating.
And this is common though, and this is the way it kind of plays out, is like including around the copyright and intellectual property, who actually owns that. And that's something that, as we said, is going to be addressed with the other principles at the same time as well. But the integrity of the story means establishing a relational model that centers and empowers story holders to have control over the use of their story beyond just capturing the story itself. So there are many ways to build story integrity into work with the story holders. This is from establishing clear publishing and review plans, guidelines, ownership agreements, and ensuring transparency about how, where, and when the story will be used. So when story partners are in positions to curate stories, where they do not have that lived experience, there is a level of responsibility to ensure that that story, the integrity of that story is maintained. So that then leads us to this question that we need to ask around integrity and that story integrity.
So with that final principle, as we mentioned, like all the other principles, they're interconnected, and therefore we cannot fully implement safe, ethical storytelling without embedding all 5 principles into our storytelling and community engagement projects and programs.
So even looking at that question, what does it mean if my involvement, what is the influence of my involvement in that story to affect that story integrity? So we talked about before was the importance of that cultural humility, knowing where our role or where that story partner's role is in that storytelling process. And that leads us to talking about these 5 principles that we've gone through today. They're all interconnected. And for powerful storytelling where we are putting the community, the story holders first, we need to embed these. This means that taking this relational approach, which addresses that power dynamics in storytelling and in community engagement processes. This will result in stories which have a far greater impact on everyone involved, in particular for the story holders and the communities who should be the rightful owners and beneficiaries of these stories.
And there are a number of examples which centre the story holder's lived experience and expertise and the positive impact, not just on the audience, but on the story holders who are included throughout the process. One example is my grandmother's lingo. It's an interactive story project about the language Mara, a language with only a few active speakers. So in this project, you can see that the principles that we've been talking about have been applied. They've gone and have sat down with this the Angelina, who's sort of the main character in this interactive story, and we really, really encourage you to go out and have a look at this and have a try, as it is an interactive thing, so it's hard to explain. Have a try, have a go. Yeah. And so what they've done is they've helped her to keep her grandmother's language alive through this really creative interactive process. They've they've collaborated along the entire way, from the inception of it, from the artists that were working on it, and ensured that First Nations perspectives were centered throughout. So in this project, it's obvious that the 5 principles were present.
And by doing this, like putting these principles in place, looking at stories like this, you can have so much more of an impact. And this is where we invite you to come and explore the potential of tests within your projects, programs, and across your organization more broadly. These 5 principles, all interconnected, you can then take these and start working towards a position where you become a leader in this area of a safe, ethical storytelling organization, which can be part of that process, can be becoming one of the first test certified organizations. And just before we leave you, here are our social media channels which you can follow us on, and a quote that I think is really important in the way that we look at progressing the way that we engage with the story holders. So if you want to engage, connect with us further, please click the link below to work together with us to flip the power of storytelling.